In the 1970s and 1980s, the city of Bowling Green was very fortunate in that we had a city council way back in the 60s that set up a city income tax. It was voted by the people and it was allocated. They specifically allocated 50% for the general fund and 33.33% for the sewer and water fund. The other were for like street repair, park and recreation, but that allowed the city to continue to have good streets, good improvements, capital improvements, and the economy then was great. Our city income tax revenues were probably averaging around 8 to 10% increase each and every year. So we had no need really to do a lot of economic development in the city. But in the mid-80s, all of a sudden the economy began to change and we no longer could depend on increases in our city income tax. In fact, they began to we did not experience any increases at all. In fact, there were a couple of years when we experienced decreases. We knew then we had to do something.
Before the CDF, the economic development that was done was probably done as much by Columbia Gas, was very involved. The university, was the major industry in town and a great industry to have, obviously with a lot of employment and bringing a lot of other value, obviously, to the community. But our industrial growth had kind of stagnated. The last things that we'd really had, probably in the late 70s, was like the Wall Street Journal came in, and again, it was a really nice addition, but it wasn't a big employer. I know that, of course, what I think when Bruce Ballard and Ed Miller were discussing this initially, a lot of the issues were about city tax revenues because they were, flat too, and it became obvious that if this continued, there was either going to be people that were here were going to have to pay more taxes in order to support the city operation, and so I think that was obviously a large part of the motivation for the outgoing and the incoming mayors to deal with.
For the 80s, I would say there was a boom in the country, in the economy, that Bowling Green did not share in as a result of that, partly by design, because I think people generally were satisfied with how things were here. But what happened was the cost of providing services to the residents by the city kept going up all during that time, had been going up through the 70s and the 80s. The tax base was pretty stagnant. Then in the mid to late 80s, when the university is starting to run into funding problems that continue to this day off and on, that was probably the first time people in our community saw what maybe other communities had experienced in other times, that sometimes the goose doesn't always lay golden eggs. So the initial response of the city was to ask the citizens for more tax money. And there were a couple of efforts with that in the late 1980s. Both of them failed miserably. I mean, basically citizens said, we don't want to pay more income tax in Bowling Green. But people still wanted all the services, which, that's probably natural.
The other reason that I would remember that there was interest in starting a community development foundation to promote economic activity was because other communities were doing it. And we looked south to Findlay, and Findlay had some success in attracting, at that time, 3 or 4 different Japanese manufacturers. And we said, well, if Findlay can do it, why can't Bowling Green do it? And the one thing Findlay had that we didn't have was someone that was in charge of economic development that really drove that activity. So the thought was, if we want to get serious about this and really be in this economic development game, we needed to have a full-time person dedicated to that. And so we needed to create an organization that could get that person in place and then just really let them run with it.